Forgotten crimes, remembered victims. Number 4. Chrissie Venn. Sadly, some crimes are mostly forgotten, murderers never facing justice for their vile deeds, and the victims in danger of being dishonored once more by being lost to history. Details are scarce in many forgotten crimes, but what little is known must be passed on so at least the victims can be remembered. Some murders are so forgotten that the facts are scarce, and when facts are scarce, imaginations take control, replacing the lack of facts with legends. The murder of Chrissie Venn is one such crime where urban legend replaces the facts, which get more and more distorted with the passage of time. And these urban legends lead to legend-tripping teenagers using the real-life tragedy as a game to prove themselves and maybe get a thrill. But what is forgotten is that there was a real human being behind the legend, a human being who had been raped and murdered at the age of 13, and most likely had been the victim of a previous attack when she had been only 10. Chrissy Claire Venn was born on July 25, 1907 to Father George Arthur Venn and Mother Eva May Venn, formerly Chilcot. They were married on April 4, 1906. By the time of Chrissy's murder, they had divorced. A possible reason for the divorce comes from author Nicholas Shakespeare in his book, In Tasmania, said on page 312. Eva was separated from her husband, who had belted her from the day he met her until the day he left. Whatever the reason, Eva had remarried to Francis Dawes at the time of Chrissy's murder. The date of the murder differs by source. Some say February 20, 1921 and others, February 26, 1921, and the duration of the search lasting from 9 or 3 days. The date on her headstone reads the 20th, but it is not uncommon for wrong dates. Because most of the latter newspaper articles, especially those dealing with the trial of George William King, say February 26, that is the date that will be used here. Descriptions of Chrissie Venn that I have found list her height as being 5 feet 4 inches or 5 feet 7 inches tall, and weighing around 8 stone, about 112 pounds. She was described as being a strong girl, well developed for her age. Locals recalled her being bright and engaging. Future suspect George William King described her as having the development of a woman. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 26, 1921, Eva May Dawes sent her daughter Chrissie Claire Venn to the nearby town of North Motton, Tasmania, Australia, a distance of roughly 3 miles, and one she walked often to pick up supplies. But on this occasion, she did not return home. After a few hours, Eva searched the road, but found nothing. The following day, the search began, and neighbors were questioned. On his way home, 17-year-old Allison Road neighbor, Robert McKay saw Chrissie in her doorway, just leaving on her trip. It was about 5 p.m. and Chrissie waved to him and said hello. The two Herbst brothers, Jack and Tom, sons of John Herbst, were working separate sections of the family farm. Jack was plowing a steep section about 100 yards above Allison Road, and noticed Chrissie below, walking a section known as Dead Horse Gully, described as a lonely stretch of Allison Road. She appeared to be in a hurry, but Jack never saw her reappear farther down the road. But most disturbing of all about the Herbst brothers' accounts was that they both heard a scream. However, neither brother investigated since it was only one scream, and they assumed the girl had only been frightened by a snake or bolting horse. Jack also later stated that he didn't think there would have been anything there to harm her. Both brothers mentioned the scream to their father, but he said he had heard nothing. About 20 minutes later, a woman identified as Florence Perton, sister of Charles Perton, and a man identified as Cyril Kennedy passed each other along the same stretch of road. Neither saw Chrissie. Note: Charles, Chick, Perton will be an important character to remember later. Some confusing newspaper reports list him as a witness to Chrissie walking down the road, and some claim he talked to her. I think these reports are false, due to poor and confusing journalism. For example, the Burnie Tasmania Advocate on March 23, 1921 says, Charles Perton saw her and spoke to her. But I think the article was referring to Robert McKay, who exchanged greetings with Chrissy, and the reporter misnamed him. It also says, Perton saw the girl passing along the road near the spot. Spot referring to the area where Jack Herbst saw Chrissy while he was plowing. So, I think the article misnamed him as a witness yet again. However, in Charles Perton's official statements, he claimed to have not seen Chrissy, something we will look at later. And, later, the article seems to support Perton's usual story that he was riding his horse to North Motton at the time, where it says important player George William King saw Charles Perton pass. Things like this show how confusing research can be, even when using primary sources of the time. In time, it would be discovered that another individual, a one George William King, had also been working in the area, either digging potatoes or tending to his pigs. He claimed to have seen Miss Florence Perton and Mr. Cyril Kennedy, as well as two people on a motorbike, and Robert Mackay, previously mentioned to have been greeted by Chrissy. The two people on the motorbike were possibly identified in the book, In Tasmania, by Nicholas Shakespeare as being an ancestor named Brodie and a friend named Gilbert Kennedy. The Launceston Examiner on March 26, 1921 provided another possibility as to who was cruising Allison Road on a motorbike. Herbert James Perton and his wife came from Ulverstone, riding a motorcycle with a sidecar, to visit local resident Charles Tamlin and then his brother, who lived along Allison Road. Note, the brother of Herbert James Perton is not the previously mentioned future suspect Charles, Chick, Perton. The article in the Launceston, Tasmania Examiner on March 26, 1921, stated they were going to visit Charles Tamlin and then go to his brother's place off Allison Road. A more detailed article published in the Launceston, Tasmania Daily Telegraph on the same date states that the brother of Herbert James Perton was named Arthur. Perton and many of the other names related to this case are very common in this part of Tasmania. There is even a road named Perton Road that connects to Allison Road. Even on a usually lonely stretch of Tasmanian road, there were at least 3 people named Perton traveling on February 26, 1921, at around the time of the murder, including Charles, his sister, Florence, and now Herbert James Perton. So, it seems that although this was a well-traveled stretch of road at around the time of Chrissy's travel along it and murder adjacent to it, only Jack Herbst actually saw her briefly, only moments before he and his brother heard her scream. Search parties scoured the area. Finally, on March 1, Jack Herbst suggested they check the tree stumps in the area. A person named Charles Taylor investigated a large tree stump about 40 yards above the road. It was burned around the base and it appeared to Taylor that the charred wood looked as if it had been crushed or walked upon. He then noticed what was described as a spike of burnt wood sticking out the side of the stump, and this spike had what appeared to be a boot print. Descriptions of the stump differ in it being 9 or 12 feet high, about 33 feet in circumference around the base and 20 feet in circumference around the top. As Taylor clambered up the stump, he began hearing the incessant buzzing of a swarm of blowflies. He noticed the blowflies hovering over a cavity only 16 inches wide. He looked into the cavity. There she was, stuffed head first into the cavity, which was only 16 inches wide. Her body was about 6 feet down. She was bottomless, buttocks bruised, but still had on her white stockings and black shoes. She was also wearing a white dress, white calico petticoat, black garters, and had a green ribbon tied around her waist. A white cloth was also found under her left stocking near her knee, perhaps a clean replacement for her sanitary napkin. According to the Launceston, Tasmania Daily Telegraph on March 24, 1921, she had a gold chain bangle around her right wrist, and was wearing what was described as a gold wedding ring on the right-hand ring finger. Legend states she was horribly mutilated and even decapitated, but those are only legends. I did find accounts from the time that mentioned mutilation, including the Burnie Advocate, March 2, 1921, Newcastle Sunday, March 4, 1921, and the Sydney Farmer and Settler, March 11, 1921, and others. But I think this was just to illustrate the horrible nature of the crime. After all, A girl between 5'4" and 5'7" in height, and weighing about 112 pounds was stuffed 6 feet down into a rough hole 16 inches in diameter. It's a wonder more damage had not been done. They lowered a man named Bossy Jones into the cavity, chosen for the grim task because he was the smallest man there. He tied a rope around her waist. After they removed Chrissy's body from the stump. Her face was described as swollen, livid, and blood-stained. She had maggots on her eyelids and in her mouth. Her petticoat and dress were torn and stained with blood and dirt. She had a foot-long length of baling wire tied around her neck, although it was thought this was tied around her neck after death, and that the killer used it to hoist her body up the height of the stump. The length of wire had been taken from the Herp's gate. The cause of death was determined to be suffocation. A piece of cloth, most likely torn from her dress or petticoat, with an attached gold bar brooch were stuffed down her throat. One of the men who helped recover the body lost his faith in God at the sight of her. She had most likely been attacked from behind. The sleeve of her dress was torn in a manner suggesting someone had grabbed it and pulled her to him. Her left breast was bruised. Her cricoid cartilage had been broken, as if the killer put her in a chokehold while he forced the cloth and broached down her throat. Perhaps she had tried to run away, only to be chased down, but managed to get out one scream before the killer pulled her to him and stifled any further attempt to cry for help. Sometime during the attack, the killer ripped off a piece of cloth she was using as a sanitary napkin along with the safety pins she had used to pin it to her underwear. He had also yanked out a portion of blood-stained pubic hair. Searchers also found a bloody stick at the scene. The killer had completed his assault. 2 smears of sperm were recovered from her vagina. Beneath her body, at the bottom of the cavity, was recovered her basket, cap, pudding cloth or handkerchief depending on source, empty bottle or bottle of kerosene depending on source, and underclothes. The money her mother had given her to pay for the supplies was missing. Interesting that a gold brooch, and if the Launceston Daily Telegraph March 24 article was right, gold chain bangle and gold ring were not taken. Could these have been prized possessions Chrissy was known to have worn? Perhaps the wedding ring was an inherited family heirloom? These would have been items that Chrissy would have proudly shown off, and would have been known to the locals. A local resident could not have risked taking these items should authorities later find them in the murderer's possession. Someone passing through would not have known the potential importance of these items, and could have pawned them at a later time at a safer distance. To make this even more tragic was that Chrissy survived a previous sexual assault earlier, when she was only 10. Although the alleged perpetrator was acquitted for the crime. The first alleged sexual assault was written about in the Northwestern Advocate and the Emu Bay Times, on Thursday, November 29, 1917. Was Newman Allen faced the charge of indecently assaulting a girl named Chrissie Venn at North Motton. After hearing the case, the magistrate committed the accused for trial at the next sitting of the Supreme Court at Launceston. On Wednesday, February 20, 1918. The Launceston Examiner printed the events of that trial. A middle-aged man named Newman Allen, a farmer at North Motton, was arraigned on charges of having on November last year assaulted a girl aged 10 years and 3 months, with intent to carnally know her, and with having indecently assaulted the girl. The Solicitor General, in outlining the case, explained that the little girl had been sent by her mother to the accused place for some milk. When the girl reached the house, Allen was not up, and she waited until he dressed. He asked her to go with him to get the cows, and when they got into the bush, the accused, seizing the girl without any warning, pushed her onto the ground and attempted the offense. The girl cried out and struggled, and having got free went home and told her mother of the occurrence. Newman Allen was found not guilty. The rape charges might have been acquitted because the rape itself might not have been completed. As the article stated, he asked her to go with him to get the cows, and when they got into the bush, the accused, seizing the girl without any warning, pushed her onto the ground and attempted the offense. Perhaps the act had not been completed, the attacker not completing penetration with his penis, but he could have broken her hymen with his fingers before she got away. And her hymen being broken was later recalled by Dr. Ferris. I don't know what Australian laws of that time were like, but it is possible that if whatever the legal definition of rape, at that time and place, had not occurred, the accused could have been acquitted, even if an assault had taken place. It wouldn't be the first or last time that someone got off on a technicality. So, who was Newman Allen? Newman Allen was a local North Motton farmer. He was married to a wife named Alice, and the father of 5 sons. The oldest was 17 at the time of Allen's death. He died on July 30, 1922 at the age of 42, from lingering complications for an appendectomy for which he spent 5 months in the Ulverstone Hospital. He was a member of the UADD, the United Ancient Order of Druids, a fraternal organization. So in the end, Newman Allen was acquitted. But then guilty parties go free all the time, even today. And I am suspicious about the fraternal order he was a member of. There are many influential members of such groups, and even if they are benevolent and charitable, they sometimes draw scrutiny for their secretive behavior. Other members of the order might not like the finger pointed at one of their brothers. It could draw judgment from their critics, judgment which could hinder their civic goals and reputation. Members often swear oaths of loyalty to other members. Could some of these members have had enough power to sway the jury? Who knows? I'll leave it up to you, the viewer, to make your own opinions. The coroner, Dr. Fred Ferris, conducted the autopsy the following day, March 2. And an initial inquest was quickly conducted. Also present were Detective Harmon and Sergeant Tompkinson. And that was the beginning of enough incompetence to go around the investigating team to ensure that any killer would have gotten away with it. Dr. Ferris had little, if any, experience in dealing with criminal forensic examinations. He would change his story many times over the course of the coming court proceedings, probably even more than the suspects. And by the time he remembered that he had forgotten to do a standard part of the investigation, collecting tissue samples from under Chrissy's fingernails, it would be too late. By the time they exhumed her body, 36 days had passed in the grave, and the body's decomposition was too great. He even forgot that he had been the doctor who had examined Chrissy before the trial for her first alleged rape. The lead investigator, Detective Harmon, did his own fair share of screwing things up by focusing on his lead suspect, George William King, while ignoring other viable suspects. In the end, this would cost him his job. After the autopsy, Chrissy's funeral began at 6 p.m. After the funeral at the Methodist Church, a grim procession of her wreath-carrying classmates from the local state school led the hearse carrying Chrissy's body in a casket of polished Tasmanian oak with silver mountings. She was then interred at the Methodist cemetery. Local residents paid the funeral expenses. A subscription service was started to pay for her headstone. And now the race was on to find a suspect. Searchers on the scene had noticed scratches on George William King's hand and face. And fingers were quickly pointed. King was new to the area. He was 36, married, and a father. He had worked previously as a police officer. He was described as being 6'4" and thinly built, but with a powerful frame. He had also been spending time at Chrissy's house, sometimes there till midnight. But he claimed to never have spent the night. He had made Eva a barrow. Detective Harmon suggested that Eva had paid for the barrow with sexual favors. It later came out that Chrissy had been afraid of King, and sometimes even hid when he was around, although King claimed he did not know why. When questioned about the scratches, King claimed to have gotten the scratches while cutting bracken a few days before the search party and reopened them while searching for Chrissy when he stumbled over a log. He also claimed that scratches on his face were made during what he called skylarking with his wife and daughter when he and his wife were both trying to get a kiss from the daughter, a game they often played with the child, seeing who could get the first kiss of the day from her. On March 6, King received an anonymous letter saying, "Take care, I saw you murder Chrissie Venn, and if you don't confess, I am going to tell the police." There was also a drawn picture of a hanged man on the gallows. King suggested that Jack Herbst wrote the letter. Detective Harmon and his superior, a Detective Oakes, thought that a woman had written it. After a few days, the letter disappeared. Detective Harmon continued to try and force a confession, going so far as to shove Chrissy's blood-stained clothes and the baling wire that had been tied around her neck in King's face. But even after Harmon's increasingly vicious questionings, King's demeanor was described as cool and self-possessed during the coroner's inquest, and he had a bright and intelligent appearance. During the inquest, the scratches on King's hands were further scrutinized, and the coroner determined that the marks on the hand of King appeared to have been scooped out. They could have been caused by human fingernails. But then, as previously stated, Dr. Ferris realized he had screwed the pooch by forgetting to scrape under Chrissy's fingernails for tissue samples. And when they finally got around to exhuming her body, too much time had passed and the decomposition too great. Ferris also had trouble determining whether Chrissy had recently engaged in consensual sex, only confirming that her hymen had been broken some time before her murder. And then, as previously mentioned, Ferris realized that he himself had been the doctor who had examined Chrissy during the first rape accusation only 2 or 3 years earlier, when Chrissy was 10 or 11, depending on source. After a lengthy coroner's inquest, the jury's verdict read: "We find that the deceased, Chrissie Venn, was willfully murdered on Allison Road, North Motton, on February 26, 1921 by some person or persons unknown." And the Attorney General determined that King be brought before the police magistrate at Ulverstone for magisterial investigation on the capital charge in connection with the murder of Chrissie Venn. During the magisterial investigation, Chrissy's mother, Eva, was the first to take the stand. She grew hysterical when Chrissy's possessions were shown. She cried,
"Don't show them to me. You murdered my girl, you murdered my girl."
She also later yelled at King. King's defense stated he was home at the time of the murder, that he had cooperated with police in every way, even giving them evidence that might be used against him, and allowing the wounds on his hands to be photographed without complaint. They said that there was absolutely no evidence to connect King with the crime. The prosecution had practically asked the accused man to prove himself guilty. They also brought up that King was a former policeman and that Detective Harmon may have had animosity toward him. King's wife supported his statements, although she was called out for giving earlier conflicting statements that she did not know where he had been at the time of the murder. The police magistrate sided with the prosecution, determining King be placed on trial at the Supreme Court in Launceston. King's trial began on August 2. The growing sensationalism of the case drew greater attention. King secured the defense of future Tasmania Premier, Albert Ogilvie, who proceeded to rip the prosecution's case against King to shreds. King's previous descriptions as being cool and self-possessed at previous hearings had changed drastically. King now wept openly on the stand and claimed to be innocent. Whether this was the effect of the grueling toll taken over the previous months, or suggested by Ogilvie to gain sympathy, is debatable. Also debatable is King's guilt or innocence, but at least Ogilvie brought up other viable suspects that Detective Harmon, for whatever reason, previously ignored. Ogilvie's main suspect was the already mentioned Charles Chick Pertun, an illiterate farm hand. Pertun had been seen by King riding his horse down Allison Road at around the time of the murder. His sister Florence had also been in the vicinity at around the same time, as was Cyril Kennedy. Pertun supposedly left his home at 3 or 5 p.m., depending on source, to go to the store in North Motton, which would most likely have been the same store Chrissy was going to. Here he changed his story 3 times. First, he claimed to have gotten back home at 11 p.m. Then he changed his story to 10 p.m., and finally 8:45. And he never gave an adequate answer as to why he changed the times. Ogilvie surmised at the time Pertun was seen on Allison Road that it would have been close enough to the time of Chrissy's own travels that he should have seen her and should have heard her scream. Pertun would have passed only about 40 yards from the murder scene, while Jack Herbst, who was plowing about 300 yards away on a steep stretch of field, both saw Chrissy and heard her scream. Ogilvy's final argument against Perton was that his testimony had been contradictory, questionable, and suspicious. And he asked the jurors, who was the most likely person to commit such a crime, a married man with an attractive wife or a young man of the locality? However, that argument wouldn't have gone far with modern jurors. Married men with children often commit rapes and murders. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury declared King not guilty. Those in the courtroom and the growing crowd outside the courthouse cheered. So, who killed Chrissie Venn? King, Perton, or someone else? A traveling tramp, named Patrick Williams, was arrested at Overstone on vagrancy charges. He had 16 shillings on him that he couldn't account for and acted peculiar. It turned out that he had been working on a farm only a half-mile from the murder scene, and had been seen walking past the stump the day after the murder. Funny that Williams never became a bigger suspect. Detective Harmon thought the killer might have returned the day after murdering Chrissy and stuffed her in the stump at that time. But I guess he already had his heart so set of King that someone fitting his own suspicion was ignored. But why wouldn't the tramp have taken the jewelry Chrissy was reported to have been wearing? He wouldn't have known the possible significance, and could have risked pawning the items at a later time. During the search, George King was heard commenting, he wouldn't want to be in Hearp's shoes. Whether he thought Jack Hearps was the killer or just that he should be ashamed of himself for hearing Chrissy scream and not investigating is debatable. And could King's comment, the comment of a former police officer, have put enough fear into the Hearps boys that they decided to divert attention to the new outsider? After all, it would have been easier for two to grapple the 112 pounds of Chrissy's dead weight up a 9-foot-tall tree stump. North Motton was a tightly knit community, many of the residents being related in some way or close, lifelong friends. After all, Chick Perton's sister had been on Allison Road the day of the murder, and detectives Harmon and Oakes thought the intimidating letter received by King had been written by a woman. Could this letter have been written by Perton's sister, Florence, to divert attention away from her brother, or could someone really have seen King murder Chrissy? I can see an argument in support of King, Perton, the traveling tramp, Patrick Williams, possibly a vengeful Newman Allen, or even the Hearps brothers being guilty. After all, the stump Chrissy had been stuffed into was only 22 yards away from the Hearps gate, a gate made from the same baling wire that had been tied around Chrissy's neck. It would also have been easier for two people to haul her body to the top of the stump and stuff her inside. Considering yet again possible reasons for Chrissy's jewelry not to have been taken, but her money was. Was that King's law enforcement training would have told him to take the cash, but leave incriminating evidence, such as identifiable jewelry, behind. At 6'4", his height would have helped him haul Chrissy up the stump. The wounds on his hand are in the logical place you would think cuts from baling wire could have occurred while hoisting a body up the stump. And it was said Chrissy was afraid of him, even hiding from him on occasion. Charles Perton's ever-changing timeline cast suspicion on his movements on the day. And the timeline of events concocted by Ogilvy show that Perton should have been in the direct area at the same time as Chrissy, and should have at least heard her scream. But you could make a similar argument that if Jack Hearps could see a girl walking down Allison Road from 300 yards, he should have been able to see a man on horseback at around the same time and distance. And Hearps never mentioned seeing Perton. He also never mentioned seeing Florence Perton or Cyril Kennedy, although King mentioned seeing all of them. In the end, no one else was ever charged for the rape and murder of Chrissie Venn. Chrissy's grave is in the North Motton Methodist Cemetery in North Motton, Tasmania, Australia. Strangely, her grave is located some distance from the others. Why? Could the previous rape have made the locals think of Chrissy as damaged goods? Children did not have the same protections they do today when making allegations. Her name and allegations were well known, as was the fact that her alleged attacker was acquitted. Victim shaming could have played a part in the local view of Chrissie Venn. Locals described her being bright and engaging, but that really doesn't say much. And any local sexual predators could have used the former rape trial in an effort to intimidate her and force themselves on her. After all, if the courts failed to help her once, they might not even listen a second time. And if she had become the target of local scorn after the first trial, she may have been hesitant to go to the authorities again. The last part of the Chrissie Venn story to be looked at is the paranormal aspect. It wasn't long after Chrissy's murder that the site became a gathering place for curiosity seekers. Even photos from the day show people gathering along Allison Road. As time went by, teenagers quickly turned the murder into an urban legend, trying to get a thrill out of going to the area as a rite of passage to show their courage. The stump was removed many years ago. But when it existed, the goal was to go there at midnight and walk around it. At some point, the legend stated that Chrissy had been decapitated and the symbol of an axe became associated with the murder. It is said that sometimes there is an axe painted on the road to point in the direction of where the stump used to be. And some have even claimed to see an axe floating along the roadside. Cars stall, and drivers experience mechanical problems. Some see phantom lights following them. Some have even experienced their cars surrounded by thick, black smoke. Horse riders have claimed horses will refuse to walk past certain spots on the road. People report screams and blood-curdling shrieks echoing through the area. Then, there are those who have seen the apparition of Chrissy walking along the road. Some have claimed to pick up who they believed was a young, stranded girl, only to have her disappear from the car. Most of the paranormal events are reported in an area known as the Dip. Of course, Chrissy's murder happened in Dead Horse Gully. Could it be that this area of Allison Road is called the Dip today? It's always sad when urban legends replace the facts of historical events. When the tragic murders of innocent victims are replaced with made-up nonsense, it is doubly tragic. There never was an axe associated with Chrissy's murder. She was not decapitated. How this became part of the legend is not known. As for her ghost, who knows? That is up for viewers to determine for themselves based on their personal beliefs. It is not uncommon for people to report ghostly phenomena at the sites of murders and other horrific events. I've never been there, probably never will, so all I can relate is what others have experienced. No doubt alcohol and/or drugs play a part in many such experiences. But not all witnesses were drunk or high. It is often thought that the cause of many hauntings is that the ghost does not know it is dead. Something happens in the human mind during traumatic events where after accident or victimization the experiencer forgets the trauma. The psychiatric term for this is dissociative amnesia. Could a victim who dies horribly experience such a mental state just before death that the spirit moves on without realizing the violence and trauma that caused death? Perhaps the disembodied spirit only recalls what it was doing before the sudden violence, and does not even know that its body died. If that happened to Chrissie Venn, is she doomed to continue walking along Allison Road toward a destination she will never reach? Whatever the truth of it, paranormal experiences can never replace the facts of the brutality of Chrissy's murder. And even recently after her murder, the locals knew that she would haunt the area, whether as a ghost, or as a memory. A 1B Horton wrote this memorial to Chrissy as part of a solicitation effort to raise money for her headstone. B. Horton wrote,
In memory of Chrissie Venn. To the editor. Sir, when the horror of the deed which took away an innocent life has passed our mind, we recall the fact that by the death of Chrissie Venn, virtue has received a crown of glory, which time can never efface. And a child has taught us that even in this sordid world there yet remains all the attributes of the divine, which now and again will shed forth their rays to teach us that the immortal spirit still exists. And with the hope that others will help to raise a worthy monument to the memory of this young heroine, I enclose my own small contribution, and remain yours, etc. B. Horton.